racing day today, and thank you very much for all of you coming here this morning and enjoy the breakfast. I think we go right to it. This exhibition is called Two Directions Become All Directions, and all the works that you see here are on from a particular series called the Gently Painted series. And David is going to talk about that this morning, how he got there from his previous one, how he got to this one.
Thank you very much, Connie.
Thank you.
Firstly, thanks everyone for coming. It's very generous of you to come. I'll try not to make this a lecture, but more a discussion. And thank you in particular, Connie, Florian and staff here for putting together this brunch and for hosting the exhibition. I know how much work all of that requires. One of the interesting places as an artist is where do you start talking about your work, because each body of work is a culmination of a lifetime's activity. And I guess that's what living is for all of us. Each moment is the culmination of what's gone before. So I'll be talking about this work in the context of obviously previous work that I've done, but also about why I hope it's useful to people and some of the issues that underpin it. As Connie mentioned, the work's called When Two Directions Become All Directions. So there are a couple of implications in that, both about time, about reconciling differences, and accommodating a type of complexity in the way that we live. And I've tried to say that as simply and as directly as I can. And sometimes that means that your work gets called an ism. Some people will call this conceptual abstraction, or they'll call it a minimal type of painting. And in one sense, that's a shorthand for what it is. But I like to think about them as experiences, and if you can engage with them, and hopefully they will hold you long enough for you to engage with them, over time, certain things start to occur and start to happen within the work. And they have, in other words, a type of contemplative function. And the contemplative in that sense is not about avoiding reality, but perhaps trying to reveal the nature of our perceiving and to become aware of what it is we're looking at in that sort of context. A friend of mine, Dr. Shelley Sachs Professor Shelley Sachs, I should give her correct title, from Oxford Brookes University in England, is an artist who works in the field of social sculpture, and she was a student of Joseph Beuys and wrote a book on him. And in this book she started to talk about the aesthetic. And when I was a student, I used to hear the word the aesthetic. My eyes would glaze over, and I'd have to deal with ideas of what beauty means. And there's nothing wrong with beauty. In fact, I think there's something about rediscovering beauty is critical in our world today. But in the context that Shelley was using the word, she was using it as an opposite to the word anaesthetic. An anaesthetic is something that dulls life, dulls feeling. And perhaps if we think of the aesthetic, we can think of that as something that heightens feeling. It's a very simple way, I think, of looking at contemporary art. And it's a way of looking at, does this work provide an energy? Does it provide questions? Does it provide challenges about the nature of what it is? And hence the nature of what we can think about our own engagement with being in time and in this mystery of the world that we live in. So in some ways that underpins some of the ideas in why I use colour, for example, or why I use this particular sort of gesturing. And some of you may remember my earlier works here with Connie, where the edges of say, fields of colour would sometimes function in relationship to a photograph, or some of the paintings themselves had a harder edge. And it wasn't about being perfect in those things, but it was about having a type of precision about how one colour related to another colour. But within those fields of colour, there was always touch. They were not trying to be perfect. They weren't trying to be machine-like. They were trying to deal with a way in which I could intervene either with a photograph or on the field of a canvas itself, or in some of the other works in installation and in an immersive environment, how those things can affect our experiencing of the world as something that we know and something that we feel. So this body of work tends to heighten an aspect of touch and gesture in the work. And it's a body of work that I've been working on probably for 2 years, and had its genesis even earlier than that. Without making this work autobiographical, I think there's one thing that heightened my awareness of touch, and that was being ill. I was in hospital for a while. And one of the things I noticed was that doctors and nurses don't touch you in a particular, they will prod you, but they won't touch you. They won't, I don't know if anyone's been in hospital, but I finished up giving a tube to some interns really about the idea of touching, and about the importance of what the tactile is in the way that we communicate. And that tactile doesn't have to be the bravura, grandiose statement, he said, standing in front of a large work like this. But it can be a much more subtle thing. It can be something to do with a gentler engagement with the world, with a softness, with a humanist sense. I think it was Virilio, who was a French philosopher and theorist and curator. He said the difference between a slap and a caress is speed. And so if you think of these works, they've got a particular speed to the way that they're made. And hopefully that speed is closer to a caress than a slap, although sometimes we need to be slapped. And hopefully there's enough energy in them that will give you a conceptual and psychological slap if you need it. And they basically follow on from some of the ongoing interests I've had in my practice. And perhaps I'll just very briefly, because I want to give you guys time to ask questions if you're interested, or to make comments if you're interested. I'll perhaps go through 3 streams of work that are in this exhibition. 1 are the photo paintings, 2 are the paintings themselves, and then there's some unframed photo paintings that I just mentioned. There's 1 on the wall, or 2 on the wall in the next gallery. The way that I use photography is not just about what it depicts in terms of those simple snaps. I go around the universe with a really high-keyed digital camera, and I'm saying that ironically, and snap what I find of interest. And sometimes these photos are useful, and sometimes they're not. The little photo painting over there that's in the Melbourne Know It catalogue, which is a big show in Melbourne that I was curated into, is simply called When Two Directions Become All Directions, Green, Korea. So it's a pretty upfront, straight title. It's a snap from a train on the way to the airport with 2 little figures in it, in a part of Incheon where there are new high-rise developments happening. So there's a scale between the individual figures in there and the buildings, and it just seemed there was a blur that happens with that type of photography that's not about, again, perfect focus or whatever, but it's the sensation that a photograph captures the past. And then there's another sort of layer of time, another past, which is recorded in that work, which is the time of painting. And that operates at a different speed, a different time. And in fact, it's a very simple experience when you look at that. What does that gesture do in relationship to the speed of a photograph? What does that colour do in relationship to the speed of a photograph? How is it made, and what are the material differences between those things? And what's that got to do with the way we think about our experiencing of the world? It automatically brings up the idea that the world is a complicated place, that we live amid composite ideas and issues. And perhaps we need to be aware of that in this current world. Things are not necessarily simple on one level, but on another level, we're all part of the same journey. And there are some fundamental questions about being present in the world that I think abstraction can deal with in a particular way. So I tend to describe my paintings as being present. And in some ways that's why the reflected surfaces of the black work here, which again is, if you like, a sibling of one of the larger works that's in the Melbourne No exhibition, which is a continuation of these black reflection paintings that I've been doing. And that contains dust, and a certain way of looking, it looks at both the micro world of dust and the macro world of what's reflected in front of it, as well as the gesture of its own time of making. And then there's a counterbalance of these things. There are basically two brush strokes in that one. The grey one's got 3 brush strokes. This one has got 2 giant brush strokes, and it tends to work in a very simple way. You go from the left to the right and the right to the left. Those 2 giant brush strokes are made up of lots of little strokes, so there's a minutiae and a big thing. But if you imagine 2 big rectangles overlapping and then fusing, that's what happens with these works. And the way that we therefore see that, if you spend some time in front of it, hopefully you will tend to disappear into the perceptual, atmospheric space of that colour. And then you'll be spat out again to a surface. And then you'll be spat out again to the edges of the picture, and the way it sits in the world as an object, and the way that it recovers both the blur gesture of time and the negative space of the canvas and the positive space of the paint, and then the fact that that gets flipped and the positive and negative become questionable, so that there's a harmony or a balance between those things. Hopefully that's the way it works for you, because that's the way it works for me, and it's not just about what I'm trying to make people believe, but from my experience of the way people have responded to that's one of the functions of what happens. So you finish up within this mobile world stated about these ideas as simply and as directly as I can. Works like this, which again is just a very simple digital image that's blown up to the point where it's almost pixelating, but not quite. It's a snap in Cornwall in England, where I had a residency last year, in Ben Nicholson's old studio, not far from this part of the coast. And again, when putting these things together, if you start to think of them about time and not just about what it's of, but what's being manifest through a photograph and what's being manifest through a gesture, then you've got the opportunity to perhaps think about similarity and difference, about fusion and movement, and the fact that we're living in a mobile world and that we have to negotiate that in as flexible way as possible. This issue of time is important, but it's not as if that comes out of a vacuum. It's a tradition in Western painting, both very old and in a contemporary sense of artists dealing with these things. And this is part of this language. you'd automatically think of, if you're informed about contemporary painting, people like Gerhard Richter, but there are plenty of other people that are dealing with these issues. As well as having similarities to his work, there are also differences. So what are those differences? I won't enumerate them here, but there are those differences, and they can range from what they're made from as to the way that they're made, as well as what gets addressed with those relationships, not just the fact that something's painted on a photograph. There's plenty of people who have been doing that in lots of ways ever since the invention of photography. The idea of superimposition and juxtaposition are principles that we live amid. But there's another area that's really important to me, and that is Asian art. And one of the great joys of living in Australia is that we've got access both to Indigenous art, we've got an access to a Western tradition, and we've got an increasing access to Eastern traditions. And one of the art movements that I've found great joy in contemplating is the Dietzschold movement in Korea, which comes out of a monochrome tradition that developed in the 1970s and into the 80s in Korea and continues today. And that in turn was formed by certain principles of Taoism and Buddhism in a way. But in a way it's like that Asian idea of the Zen, of you're in front of it, it is what it is, somehow marries this Western notion of the phenomenology of how we are experiencing the world. And in the Dietzschold movement, with artists like Li Yufan, for example, who has been linked with that movement, although not a card-carrying member, there's a very interesting relationship about how we, as people coming from our own specific culture, can engage with those sorts of things. So in a global world, we're starting to find that some of this language that is accessible to people from different traditions, and people are bringing different traditions to this language. So it's not about the idea that was popular when I was a student about modernism and minimalism, about the image being reduced and reduced and reduced, but it's really about how do I place a very simple field of experience in the world in order that that can operate as an interval in the world for contemplation. And I've done that through painting, photo paintings, and installations in my practice. In this catalogue, and again, I think for me, I read it on the plane because I haven't read it for about 5 years. It was quite useful for me to read those ideas that I've got. They've got a continuity with this slightly older work. And there's also some questions that we don't have to deal with art, I believe, in the jargon of art all the time, but we can start to look at what is the experiences that we're getting. How can we open up to the world in a flexible way? And sometimes to do that, you need a very simple, empty space to do that, in order that the richness of the world can sit in relationship to it. And I guess that's one of the intentions of that. And there's a quote that I used in this book from Pierre Bonnard, who again is one of my heroes, although you might think my work doesn't look anything like him. When you think of the imagery that Pierre Bonnard uses, and there's a wonderful example of a self-portrait in your Art Gallery of New South Wales of him in front of a mirror as an old man, and I'm racing towards my old agedness, which I'm very happy about. Because I'm sure at that point I'll get wisdom. At this point I'm not too sure. But there are similarities when you think that his paintings were of the everyday world he inhabited. These photos are of the everyday world that he inhabited. His touch was really critical. He had these blurs and blotches and beautiful relationships and accidental things that would infuriate an artist like Picasso, who was a brilliant artist but hated Bonnard because Bonnard seemed to be fidgeting for him. And but Bonnard had this quote, and it's not the matter of painting life, it's a matter of giving life to paint, which is one quote that I enjoy a lot. And the most beautiful things in museums are the windows. And so on that point, I'll offer you the window. And if there are any discussions, whether it's about my work or some of those issues, I'm more than happy to engage with you.
We'll start with the Bonner, which is very beautiful, and it's basically a yellow, pale yellow painting. So, I mean, how would you relate it to this painting?
Colour, I think, is a fantastically interesting field because it, in the West, it's got a huge range of readings. If you have a look at colour theory, there are wonderful interpretations of what particular colour mean. And they are both culturally specific, personally specific, and they change. For example, that same beautiful yellow, that's a sort of mustardy yellow from recollection in the Bonner, in medieval time, that yellow used to be a surrogate for gold. So if you couldn't afford gold leaf, you'd whack a yellow bit of colour at the back of your painting. And so yellow had this sort of almost ethereal, spiritual connotation. Then, same period in the Middle Ages, yellow started to take on a more complex, and the word in English, jaundiced, came into our vocabulary, that the idea that colour had yellow had a negative connotation. And then if you happened to be a Jew in Northern Europe at that time, in Amsterdam or in Northern Europe, you'd be asked to wear a yellow hat. And so that denoted, or a Muslim, you were being seen as a foreigner. So colours have got these complex multiplicity of readings. And in this sort of use of colour, there are some, if you like, sociological readings that have got a particular association depending on where you come from. But there's also a particular colour intensity or energy that operates. And that's, I think, what happens in Bonner. So although his yellow is made up of lots of yellows and lots of other colours that complement it, and it's got a type of busyness that a painting like this doesn't have, it does have a particular sort of colour energy. And this is where it probably links to the theories of Goethe and those sorts of people that work in that type of colour theory, as opposed to sort of the sociological or cultural analysis of colour that came out of a different historical way. So in Eastern cultures, there's a different use, like black, for example, in the West is often regarded as negative. If you speak to Indigenous Australia, it's certainly not. If you think of how black is made, it can be made artificially through pigment, but it can also be mixed. But if you mix every colour of the spectrum carefully, you'll get black. If you mix it in the right proportion. If you mix every colour of light, you get white. But black, in other words, doesn't have to be negative, it could contain everything. And grey is a similar thing for me. It's got this gentle neutrality. So those readings are quite important. Another friend of mine, David Batchelor in London, has just written a book. It's about to be published on grey, which I find really interesting. When you actually stop and think of what a colour might mean, rather than saying, oh, that's great. The possibilities of just thinking about the richness of that are quite fascinating. And so the colours... Sorry?
James Howell.
Yeah.
James Howell, an American artist from New York that I represent.
Yeah.
He's only painting in grey.
Yeah.
Always his little brush strokes, always in grey. And the enormous shades of grey is just immense.
It's fantastic. When you limit your palette, you just can't believe how complex the world is. It's a really interesting experience.
So I have a question about complexity. I mean, I'm very much with you about artist's experience, but I'm also interested in the making.
Yeah.
So when I look at this painting, I see this edge, which, as a sign, shows gesture. Okay, so you look at that. But actually making it, it's a very complex entity in the painting. And there are many ways that that could be made which wouldn't work as a sign. It does, but the actual making of such an edge seems to me to be quite a complex process. It's a complex entity, but it's also perhaps quite a complex entity in actually making it so that it performs its function.
Yes.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah, well, for sure. This has got numerous layers, as you could imagine, but they're painted very thinly. And it comes out of, as I say, probably 2 or 3 years of experimentation. This particular material it's called golden yellow, and that's not a metaphysical thing, that's the name of the brand of yellow that comes out of golden paints in America. And it's a type of acrylic. It's got an additive to it that just mats it slightly, but there's enough satin finish to give it a surface. It's got a different flow to enamel paint, which is on that one. And it's also constructed with very large brushes, like the brushes are like this size. And there's a bodily engagement with it, which is important in the way that it records not just a hand gesture, but it records the time of its making in a very particular way. And that's something, again, if you pay attention to, you'll start to see that there's a slight movement as you go through it. But it's subtle. From one distance, like one of the beauties of this is that you're trapped over there, I'm trapped over here. But the way that we actually look at work is in a mobile way, especially if you live with the work. And that's where a work grows with you over time. You can start to see the nuances. That's why it's fantastic to have the ability to live with real work. That these experiences of it change. And then there's also a smaller brush that comes into that as a final layer to unify some of those discrepancies in this, because it just became too, that was me, it just became too active for the particular sensation I wanted to deal with. But that implication of the doing is absolutely critical, and the process of making. Because process, as a practitioner, includes both idea and feeling and materiality in a way that is one of the great joys of being an artist. That if you're a writer, you can perhaps these days use a computer, but a lot of it's up here, or a limited bit down here. But as an artist, you can engage the full body, mind experience in that duration of making. Thanks for that question. It's a good one. I hope I answered it.
You mentioned the presence and experience of being in the world. I'm interested in the selection of your photograph. Was that random or day-to-day life, or was that you go to, like, say, you mentioned speed, so you set up a particular in mind and then work on that?
Yeah, they're not random, but they are snaps. They're not trying to be high-end photography. If you have a look at some of the small works, and it's about that immediacy of what happens when you've got that type of taking of a photograph, as we all do these days, either on our phones or our cameras. That's a particular way of taking a photograph. They're not, it's not accidental in the sense that I spend time looking and just won't throw the camera. Although that one was, as I say, just out a train window. So you can still adjust them on Photoshop if you need to, but I don't. They're pretty much straight. But the nature of photography, primarily in this exhibition, is of landscape photography and of place. But it's also, I work at RMIT, as you know, and I have a lot to do with some of the people in the School of Architecture. And they're always talking about place and site and how we experience space and location. And I always say, well, you always forget about time. We're also dealing with the ongoing duration of how we're experiencing that. It's not just a fixed thing, it's a lived experiencing. And one of the things about the way we negotiate landscape is that we're living through it and in it. And these photos are, in some ways, a way of dealing with that. And one of the reasons for going back to this type of imagery of using the photographic image, or using a inverted commas, a mimetic or realist view of the world, was I'd spent a number of years in my early career being a realist painter, where I tried to deal with perception and how I'd analyse reality. And then after a while I felt that skill was getting in the way of what I wanted to say through it, and I spent another 3 or 4 years unlearning that and developing a range of what you might call reductive abstraction. And that also is about extending painting into sight and into space and into time. And so I started to work on installations. And I found that the experience of that, the immersiveness of that, was really interesting. But I missed the portability of a canvas. And so I started to document those installations as photographs. And then I wanted to use those installations, those photographic sources, in relationship to that language of abstraction. And rather than surrounding you by that, asking you to use one of the conventions of what happens with the painting is that we can go up to it and it can fill our field of vision in a different way. And so it's that type of reasoning that the photograph became an important component in my work, and then it became important about the issues of time and stuff.
David, you mentioned when you were talking about this, you said that you photographed the past and painted the present. But wouldn't you say, like in that work over there, that the landscape, because the landscape is a continuum, it's neither past nor present nor future, it's a continuum, whereas the painting is a still moment, it's a moment that isn't part of a continuum because it's out of time. The photograph of its very nature is a continuum in time.
I probably disagree with part of that. I'd say that both are part of time. The photograph is of a particular moment, and sure, the image keeps going. It's our experiencing that's ongoing and durational.
Sure.
And the painting is at a particular time, but it's a different sort of time to the time of photography. It becomes a composite of times, to use a philosophical term. And so it's those issues and our experiencing of that complexity that I find interesting. So in some ways they both can be located at the time of their making, but the time of their experiencing is within the viewer who completes that journey.
Could you paint on any photo? I mean, why do you choose a certain photo to paint?
I choose them because there's a certain, probably to do with a moment that seems appropriate. I've tried painting on photos that aren't my own, and it just, they work formally, but I don't have the same intuitive relationship with them. And I think that idea of the felt is as important as the conceptual knowing, which will make, if you think about the Solar Witch show at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, he didn't want that felt in the same way. He wanted to emphasise the conceptual, but indirectly his work becomes very personal and very felt as a result of the processes. So it's about trying to acknowledge, in as much as I can, that totality of experiencing, and hopefully that will offer the idiosyncratic nature of a photograph for the viewer who hasn't had that particular moment, but it will still be of interest for them. So that's why it's a sort of archetypal photograph, this one, in one sense, of a landscape. It's a landscape, a sea and a sky that fuses. This space fuses in a different way, it comes in at a different angle, and then there's a different balance and tension between those things that hopefully are reconciled, that It's not aggressive in that sense, but it's saying there are differences, but they can sit together.
I was just going to comment on the artist experience point. And it seems to me that also leads one to talk about engagement with the work. And once you do that, you start to think about engagement over time. You indicated this earlier when you're living with the work. And what's quite clear is that experience changes over time. The experience of this painting very clearly is going to change over time, and the kind of engagement you might have with it might change over time. And it's probably, my guess is I would say this work, if you have it in one of those sort of museum places where you see it for 10 seconds, it might become quite nice, but wouldn't do what you're after. But probably someone needs to engage with it longer in order to deal with it in the kind of way that we've been discussing, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the average viewing time for a work in the museum, unless you get trapped with a video or a time-based work, is about 3 or 4 seconds. And if people are really interested, they might spend 30 seconds.
Yeah, and that's a different kind of engagement to the engagement that you have with the work that you live with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've found in my experience in the world is that often you can return to those works, or if you realise that that work is about a durational experience or a slow time, then you will give. I've spent hours in front of really empty works, and with great reward. So it's interesting.
This yellow work, I'm interested in the sort of combination of looking at these two works, but I'm sitting here seeing these, and this sort of screen or this covering and uncovering that seems to be, part of your core of your work. This one seems to me to be more about, for me, travelling, an experience of travel where you've got that fleeting landscape, and then you've got the screen, the partial screen covering it. Could be coming over like a window, more like a window, but this one is more Eastern, as I think you alluded to that in terms of the monohar or and it's about a repeated gesture because of and I thought that was very interesting I'm sorry.
Honest.
Yeah, about that edge in terms of the gesture, because it's a gesture, but it's a repeated gesture, isn't it? Because you're covering it several times, and that sort of interests me. That in terms of, say, the idea of the screen or the covering, how do you think of that in terms of making a minimal painting? Where you want more than one. You're using a very big brush, but you want more than one layer. You want to build up a layer. And how does that sit with the gesture?
Yeah, it's interesting that the first time I showed photo paintings in Sydney, someone came up to me and abused me for censoring the work by painting over the photo, that idea. And I said, well, look at what's in front of you, perhaps what's happening with that surface. And it happened to be a reflective surface. So it actually included the person's reflection in the work. And in some ways, a work like this, when you spend time with it, as well as a covering, it's where is the negative space? It's not, it's a question about the equivalence of positive and negative spaces in it. When you spend time, that surface that initially appears, the painted energetic surface, fades, and this comes forward. Then over time, that shifts. That becomes a deeper space, this becomes a surface again. So there's that movement, I think, and it becomes a relational thing with our experiences of the world. If we spend time with it, we start to notice that mobility. So it's neither just one thing or another. It's that very famous word, and. It's not an either or. And I think that is hopefully an experience that starts to happen with the work. And therefore, if you've got an and in it, it means you've got other possibilities beyond minimalism and it is both a screen and a void at different times, if that makes sense. I think that's an interesting question.
For instance, this one here, the landscape is also geometric. I mean, the photo. If it was a photo of a party with people, would the painting work have to be more gestural, like the works of Richter, where he's done it on photos of babies and things like that? It's much more gestural. It's as if you need some action in the painting because there's human action in the work, whereas the photograph there is a kind of stasis of landscape. So do you think that you could do something so non-gestural on a photograph of people, or you have, or?
Yeah, I have. There's a, if you have a look at my website, which is blatant publicity, but there's a range of different works that were based on a project I did in London called Taking a Line for a Walk, which is these were another one was of my that was shown in Melbourne a couple of years ago. Was also based on the idea of so my son's rock and roll band, about 5 members, just a bit like Abbey Road, going through a walk. And there was a timeline, what I call timelines, this thin painted line on it. And again, these were blown up to about at least 1 metre by 1.5 metres, each image, each figure. And from a distance, it looked really tight. Up close, it became pixelated, but the line became noticeable in terms of its texture and gesture. So they had a slightly different range of readings in that sort of way. So there's a timing mechanism in these works, and that's what I call the durational aspect of them. And it's about that idea of, I suppose, discovery, that not everything's revealed at once. They take a little bit of time, depending on your distance, to have these things functioning. So works like this are using some of that source photography that documented a particular performance, and then reapplying some of the principles to deal with this idea of transience and movement. And so each photograph, I guess, requires a response slightly differently. Even though it's a random photograph, you respond to it, and a lot of them get thrown away, and some of them just seem to have the right energy, going back to the beginning of the talk, of the right energy and relationship between them.
That's why I think living with a painting work is so much so better. Living with a work and a painting like this one, for example, is so much more interesting than having a 30-second look at it, because we don't have this time to spend. But if we live with something, we don't have to feel like we have to stand in front of it, and examine our own sort of feelings and the painting, the content of the painting. We just live with it, in time, in real time, and it's a very different way of enjoying something.
Sure.
It should be more.
But I think also I like the challenge of the fact that that 30-second opportunity is something useful for us to engage with, and hopefully it either becomes a question or a memory that you can then start to consider, because in some ways that's the way we live today, and it's a very privileged few that can live with actual artworks. And so I think the function of institutional collections and private collections that eventually become institutional are great. And it's almost that you have to take the opportunity when you can to stand in front of something for as long as something's starting to happen, if it's of interest to you. Again, a lot of people will say, so what? But I mean, obviously you've come today because you're nice human beings, but and you might find this of interest. But you might also go away thinking, oh, well, so what? But that's the nature of the world that we live in. It's got both a contemplative opportunity, but people have to be open to be interested in those sorts of things, or else it's not going to mean anything. I happen to love Australian rules football, so if you're not interested in Australian rules football, it's not going to do you much good. But I happen to think it's really good in that sense, so I can experience it in a particular way, and I'm open to it. But if you're closed to it, you're not going to experience Australian rules football. And the same applies to this sort of work. You have to be open to it, and I think also, like any work, the more you think about it, experience it, reflect on your experiences, investigate the context for it, the more interesting it becomes.
Can I ask you a really dumb question? I live in Italy, and one of the great treasures of the world are Italian walls, stucco walls that are, discovered in time and things like that. What's the difference between that painting and, say, an old wall that has become gestural in a certain sense and contains all of the elements that you're talking about?
It hasn't quite got intentionality. That's a difference.
That's the difference, you think?
One of the differences. It's also that it's got a much greater age and a greater patina. If I'm imagining a wall you're imagining, then this has. This has got a different thinness and a different sort of type of what it's made from. It's a painting. And so therefore it's working in that tradition. It's the same as, this has got it might have similarities to a Japanese Zen painting of an enso or an ichi or things like that operate within calligraphic painting. But it's a different material. It's a westernised, it's a material that comes out of a Western context that now is entering into a different sort of global thing. I just say, think about people like Tapias in Spain, who in his 50s and 40s was again he was basically constructing paintings that looked like walls with a graffiti on them. But those paintings, although they looked like the graffiti around Barcelona, were loaded with significance, and they were loaded with the fact that he materially constructed it in relationship to the context of the world that he was living in. So there is a difference, to them. Doesn't mean I can't enjoy, the walls in Italy or the walls in China or the walls in Melbourne, but they are of a different order.
Mm. The pleasure principle is the same, but the intent, I guess, is the difference.
I don't find them necessarily contemplative. I find them visually and tactilely interesting. This has got a different function. It's a good question.
Could this work as a tapestry?
It would work differently as a tapestry. I don't know. I wouldn't make it. But I think the tapestries that I've seen, the ones that I love, are the ones that reveal the quality of their materials. And that doesn't mean that they have to be abstract or anything. I mean, some of the most beautiful tapestries in the world are figurative. But I don't know if that would work in that way. I think it would be too slow. The texture would stop the slip or the flow. It might have the right image, but it wouldn't have the right feel.
Looking back at your work, past 10 years or so since I know you, your series were a lot more complex, a lot more multi-layered, expressed themselves in many, many different forms: installation, photographs, paintings, projections, and something like the installation we have here with the photo printing and the paintings. This series to me seems a lot more concentrated. Has that got something to do with your life, that your life had changed a lot since, I always related to Hong Kong, when we showed last in Hong Kong. I find that your work has sort of hit a real concentration point. Would you agree to this? Is that intentional, or did it just happen?
I think it's an intention to try and simplify, or to state, as I said earlier, complex things as simply as possible. But this particular exhibition is focused on painting. I'm trying to make painting do that as directly as possible. I'm still doing installations. I had an installation last year in the UK, where that sort of complexity of materiality was coming through, but it also informed, and that was an installation based on the idea of an English colour palette, within the traditional landscape palette of an English painter. And using that within a particular site. It was in a studio in Porthmeor that used to belong to, if you like, it's a history of British modernism happened in there. People like Ben Nicholson, Patrick Heron, all painted there. So the floors were like this history of splatter of colour, like a history of modernist painting that operated in Britain in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And then it had this giant skylight which had seagull splatterings on it. And that was like this wonderful idea of gravity. I think the installation is called Between Gravity. And the organic quality of the seagull splattering mixed with the Jackson Pollock-like paint splattering. So this culture, nature, space was created. And in between, I put a series of very long timeline monochrome and some photo paintings along walls, and used some of the materials that were residue in that studio to make an installation that you walk through, and including little photo paintings like this that would be sitting up on the floor like so, that were these moments of recognition. So that had a particular sort of complexity. Now these works have got, hopefully, a simplicity and a directness, as you say, a concentration that operates with them, that gives you as a viewer some space to think about these grand gestures, these big movements and slow movements, and the ideas of touch and being that are involved with the work.
Well, I had a lot of groups through because of Art Month. So a lot of groups are visiting the gallery. So I thought, before I tell them the whole concept of your work, that was quite amazing. I never sort of done that before, but it just happened. I observed myself actually being part of that group. And I said, look, before I give you the concept, I would like you to just sit still and just let the work sink into you, and then you tell me what you feel. I never done that before. And that was very, very interesting. And I said, I know that already the first person who is relating their experiences will tint the experience of the second person. I just would like you just to really sit with it and see, what do you feel, what does it do to you, how do you perceive it? And tell that yourself before you speak and before you hear someone else. And the experience was stunning. It was really amazing. Some people couldn't put any words to it because they were poor of relating to feelings. Some tried to copy what someone else was saying before. And some were quite articulate to relate what it did to them and what they felt with it. And the story that emerged out of it. It was really entertaining. And that gave me a beautiful opportunity to make people aware that art, this is exactly what viewing of art is. It is not entertainment. It is actually where you have the luxury to have some time to yourself with an artist's mind and experience this just by yourself. It's like a living meditation. And that moment you don't have in any other moment of life nowadays, isn't it? Because everything comes into you and bombards you and talks loud to you, whether here you become proactive and you determine to let it happen to you, rather than like the media or advertising or anything that is bombarding us nowadays is engaging us forcefully, whereas here it is my intent and to allow the viewer to take charge of that, to take control of that, and not a passive thing where you get hit by it, but you actually become proactive and engaging with the work.
Yeah.
That was stunning.
That's fantastic, Connie. I think that is something that we all want. One of the problems with things like this is that you tend to talk to people at a lecture. But one of the other things I just wanted to mention that you reminded me of there was that art can be fun, and art like this has got an absurdity to it as well. But it's a serious absurdity and it's a playful absurdity. You know, the idea that you make a painting that's got two giant brushstrokes is a bit odd, really. But on another level, hopefully from what I've said, as well as that playful quality, it's got something to offer people. And I guess, you know, when I look at, in this catalogue, which is again now 10 years old, in these green pages, I suppose it sums up some of the ideas of people that and thinking that have been important to me. And I just won't read it to you, but I'll go through the people. One of them was an Italian artist, Pistoletto, Pierre Bonnard, French philosopher Henri Bergson, who dealt with duration, a German architect from the Bauhaus, Jörg Mucha, who painted a bedroom gloss black, and who else was it? There was Fischli and Weiss, who in their great question about time, on time said what happened 4.56 billion years ago. If you think of that, it puts this time into context in a slightly different way. I was thinking of Martin Creed, the English artist, who in his apparent dumbness makes very entertaining works that ask you to question nothing, ask you to question seriousness and cynicism in the work. And then a quote from the Pogues, one of their songs on love. And so in the end, those two pages sum up a lot of my interests that have underpinned this work. And hopefully those residues can be done in a vaguely entertaining way in the appropriate sense of the word. You're not going to, you know, you probably would prefer to go and see a game of Australian rules football if you wanted pure entertainment. But if you want reflection, then perhaps this is an easier way to attain that. But I think it's important to let people have their own experiences of these works, and you'll have your own opinions, obviously.
Well, thank you very much. Has anyone got another burning question before we close off? From this side? No? But thanks very much for the incredible insight, and I know you could go on for hours to talk about even the brush stroke, which is phenomenal. That's what I just love about David.
On verbose, yes.
Yeah, it's this, the incredible richness of something that is so simple to clap that in an incredible vocabulary of description, but an internal description, an abstract description, not an external description, which is very uncommon. So I really do thank you for that, and I invite you to stay on and please view the work. And of course, you're very welcome to stay with David and ask him some more questions.
Thank you very much for coming, folks. I appreciate your patience and time.
And thank you for coming, especially from Melbourne for us. Thank you. Thank you so much. And if anyone likes to see some more of the photo painting.